And welcome to Sunday Assembly Nashville. I'm your host, Josh Brown, and wow, love that song. And who is that cutie doing the lead there? I might marry her someday. Oh, I already have. Yay, me. So before we jump into anything, Loie, if you can go ahead and put up the Zoom closed captioning instructions for those that might need that today. If you're using the Zoom app, click on live transcript. It'll show that pop-up menu, click show subtitle, and you should get our closed captioning just fine there. Second note before we jump in, we currently have our first Menti poll up. You can get to that poll on menti.com. And that code for that is 43290886. 43290886. So, welcome to Sunday Assembly Nashville. And yes, today is Big Game Sunday. I won't call it by its actual name because to borrow a bit from one of my favorite comedians, Mike Birbiglia, any description of the event without the express written consent of the NFL is strictly prohibited. But hopefully this game between the curly-horned quadrupeds and the orange Asian tigers should be a good one. And don't worry, we should be done in plenty of time before the pregame show starts at noon. So here at Sunday Assembly Nashville, our motto is live better, help often, and wonder more. We live better by aiming to provide inspiring, thought-provoking, and practical ideas that help people to live the lives they want to live and be the people they want to be. We help often by being a community of action, building lives of purpose, and encouraging us all to help anyone who needs it to support each other. And we wonder more by hearing talks, singing as one, listening to readings, and even playing games together. And all of these things help us to connect with each other and the awesome world that we live in. And we're not here to tell you how to live your life. We're here to help you be the best version of you that you can be. The Sunday Assembly is 100% a celebration of life. We are born from nothing and we go to nothing. So let's enjoy that together. Sunday Assembly has no doctrine. We have no set text, so we can make use of wisdom from all sources. We have no deity. We don't do the supernatural. We are radically inclusive. Everyone is welcome, regardless of their beliefs. Sunday Assembly is free to attend. We are not for profit, and we are volunteer run. We ask for donations to cover our costs and to support our community work. We have a community mission that through our collective effort, we will be a force for good. Sunday Assembly Nashville is independent. We do not accept sponsorship or promote outside businesses, organizations, or services. And Sunday Assembly Nashville is here to stay. We are pushing through this pandemic and these virtual meetings and all the things that are causing us to not be able to actually gather together. We are pushing through that. And with all of our continued involvement, Sunday Assembly will make the world a better place. And just as a rehash of point number one, Sunday Assembly Nashville is a celebration of the one life that we know that we have. So before we move further, let's take a look at that poll. So our poll was, the Sunday Assembly do a great job of encouraging diversity and inclusion. And the overwhelming view, at least for those that participated in the poll, was just an agree. We don't do the greatest job in the world of it. We kind of do okay. That kind of seems to be the what my interpretation of these results are. So that's good info to have, especially going into my opening remarks this morning. And as you all already know that are here, our speaker, Dr. Chris Cameron, will be speaking on Black Freethought from Slavery to Civil Rights in commemoration of Black History Month. And just as a side note, we will be having a short Q&A session after his talk. So please feel free to post any questions that might come up in either the Zoom or YouTube chats. And during our Q&A sessions, I will bring those questions to Chris. So, Black History Month. It might be feeling a little something off. Most pointedly, why is a white cishet male whose picture would look perfectly in place in the dictionary next to white privilege hosting an assembly for Black History Month? So I'm going to address the elephant in the room and say in no uncertain terms, Sunday Assembly Nashville has a diversity problem. And this is where the morning's host usually has an opening segment. But this morning, I'm going to step slightly out of that host role to represent myself and Sunday Assembly's Nashville's leadership as we try our best. For background, for those of you who don't know me or how the leadership structure of Sunday Assembly Nashville is set up, I am on the board of Sunday Assembly Nashville. And as such, I am one of 7 that have been entrusted with overseeing the organization as a whole, along with our chairperson, Stephen Phelps, Adam Newton, Brenda Quinn, Don Thomason, Jason Panks, and Jeannie Buitt. I am also the chairperson of our One to More committee, which plans our monthly assemblies. From the speaker, the readings, the trying my best segments, even coordinating with Stephen Phelps with the music, everything that you see here in the Zoom meetings and on YouTube, that goes through the One to More committee, and as chairperson, ultimately through me. And I tell you all of this not to brag, boast, or toot my own horn, but rather to demonstrate that I recognize my place in Sunday Assembly Nashville's leadership structure, and therefore my responsibility to and for Sunday Assembly Nashville. So in December, I contacted Chris to speak for us upon a recommendation from another committee member. And I thought Chris would be a great speaker for us because I thought that his expertise and presentation of his research was timely and would enrich our knowledge and understanding, especially in light of this month being Black History Month. So we in the Wonder More committee, we generally find and lock in our speaker for the month. So we know who we're having speak, what they're going to be talking about, and then we build the rest of the assembly program around that. So in a manner of speaking, we kind of planned ourselves into a corner. During the planning stage, I took the host role, honestly, kind of reluctantly, because we really didn't have a viable option of someone to host with this topic who has recently even attended a virtual assembly. And I, of course, realize that I really have no way to connect to the topic as host other than from a purely historical standpoint. So that makes a traditional opening statement a little bit difficult. However, I took on this responsibility as chairperson of Wonder More, so that if there's any, blowback, negative, whatever, or anything like that in this case, that's on me, and I take responsibility for that. And so back to the main point. Sunday Assembly Nashville has a diversity problem. And to be honest, this has been the case even pre-pandemic. I can only speak on what I know from when I began attending Sunday Assembly in May 2016. And at least every February from 2017 to 2020, Sunday Assembly Nashville has focused on Black History Month, and every one of those assemblies were hosted by our good friend, James Reels. And last year, we focused more on Valentine's Day, perhaps maybe as a subconscious workaround to not address what I'm speaking about currently. And yes, I could have asked James to host this morning, but I made the conscious decision not to do so. As much as he was happy to host those previous assemblies, I don't want to parade him out in front as our token Black person. See, we have Black people, we're diverse. Aren't we just great? And I know that he never saw that as tokenizing and always held the view that we were basically doing the best that we could with who we had. And I am forever thankful to him for that, for trying to shed a positive light essentially wherever he was, and for granting us his own flavor of grace. But that still doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to encourage diversity. I also had to think about Sunday Assembly Nashville's entire BIPOC representation. I only need two hands to count those within Sunday Assembly Nashville that I can recall and am aware of that fit in that description. And again, that count is even pre-pandemic. I look to our board, of which I'm a part. All white, 5 men, 2 women. We even have a slight problem with gender diversity. And although I want to say that this lack of diversity is no fault of ours, and indeed we have tried to encourage BIPOCs to run for spots on the board, if we as an organization did more to encourage diversity in our attendees, perhaps that would lead to more diversity in our leadership. Sunday Assembly Nashville has a diversity problem. And there's a saying that the first step to a solution is recognizing that a problem exists. And this is that recognition. I also fully realize that at this point, all of this is just words. But I will say that it's with heavy effort that we intend to follow this up with action. And this is where you come in. I know that virtual assemblies are difficult to stick with regardless, but as we in leadership look forward to resuming live assemblies, we also desperately need input regarding things that we can do to encourage diversity and our attendees and not be as white-centric as we are. Please reach out to any of us, post on our secret Sunday Assembly Nashville Facebook page. If you're not already there, touch base with one of us and we can get you there. We want to hear your thoughts and ideas because we, all of us, are Sunday Assembly Nashville. So let's help each other to try our best. And with that said, let's move to our reading this morning, being read by Stephen Barry, and he will be reading Goodbye Christ by Langston Hughes.
Goodbye Christ by Langston Hughes. Listen, Christ, you did all right in your day, I reckon. But that day's gone now. They ghosted you up a swell story too, called it Bible. But it's dead now. The popes and preachers have made too much money from it. They've sold you too many. Kings, generals, robbers, and killers, even to the Tsar and the Cossacks, even to the Rockefellers' church, even to the Saturday Evening Post. You ain't no good no more. They've pawned you till you've done wore out. Goodbye, Christ, Jesus, Lord, God, Jehovah. Beat on it away from here now. Make way for a new guy with no religion at all. A real guy named Marx, communist, Lenin, peasant, Stalin, worker, me. I said me. Go ahead on now. You're getting in the way of things, Lord. And please take Saint Gandhi with you when you go, and Saint Pope Pius, and Saint Amy McPherson, and big black Saint Becton of the consecrated dime, and step on the gas, Christ. Move. Don't be so slow about moving. The world is mine from now on. And nobody's going to sell me to a king or a general or a millionaire.
Thank you for that great reading, Stephen, and thank you for stepping in this morning and helping us with that.
Yeah.
So at this time, please allow me to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Christopher Cameron, excuse me. I'm still a little. Dr. Christopher Cameron is professor of history and interim chair of the Africana Studies Department at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He was the founding president of the African American Intellectual History Society. Chris received his BA in history from Keene State College and his MA and PhD in American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research and teaching interests include early American history, the history of slavery and abolition, and African American religious and intellectual history. He is the author of To Plead Our Own Cause, African Americans in Massachusetts in the Making of the Anti-Slavery Movement, and Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism. He is also the co-editor of Race, Religion, and Black Lives Matter, Essays on a Moment and a Movement. and also new perspectives on the Black intellectual tradition. His current book project, entitled Liberal Religion and Race in America, explores the intersection of race and liberal religion dating back to the mid-18th century and the varied ways that liberal theology has informed African-American religion and politics in the 20th and 21st centuries. Please welcome Dr. Chris Cameron.
Thank you for that introduction, Josh, and for the invitation to speak here this morning. Thanks as well to Jason and the rest of the production team for everything they're doing to make this event happen. And finally, thanks to all of you who are here this morning. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of the research and conclusions from my book, Black Freethinkers, A History of African-American Secularism, which was published in 2019 by Northwestern University Press. So I became interested in researching this topic as I was finishing up my first book on African-American abolitionists in early America during the Revolutionary period. I was sort of finishing up, final footnotes and putting the bibliography together and all of that. And I had to enter in, one of my sources was Al Raboteau's classic work, Slave Religion, The Invisible Institution in the Antebellum South. And for most of the book, Raboteau is charting the rise of sort of a syncretic form of Black Protestantism that combined elements of Christianity and African traditions into making something unique. But towards the end of the book, he has a couple of paragraphs that starts out saying, of course, not all slaves believed in these ideas that he'd been charting for most of the book. Some simply couldn't reconcile their lives in bondage with the notion of a just and benevolent God. And then he gives maybe two examples. It's nothing super extensive. But even just that little bit right there really piqued my interest, right? I was like, whoa, atheism in the slave community, right? I'd just written a book on sort of the intersections of Puritan theology and Black abolitionism, and sort of bought into this idea that, most Black people in slavery were religious to some extent, right? Whether it was Christianity or whether they were Muslims or practiced their own African traditions. But it had just never occurred to me that there were people during this time period adopting some of the same, skeptical positions as folks like Thomas Paine, right? Or Francis Wright, in the 1820s and 1830s. So that sort of led me down the rabbit hole. This was in late 2012. That led me down the rabbit hole that eventually became Black Freethinkers. So I first thought to myself, all right, well, he's saying that, he gives a couple of examples of atheism in slave communities, right? So let me start there. So I went to this website documenting the American South, which has, dozens, if not hundreds of slave narratives. And I just started reading as many as I could, right? And through reading slave narratives, through reading travel accounts of ministers and other people coming down South and spending time on Southern plantations, what I found is that outright atheism was present within slave communities as early as the 18 teens and 1820s. And that this is something that, aside from Raboteau's brief mention of it, really had not been documented by historians. And Anthony Pinn, of course, has done a lot of work on African-American humanism. The literary scholar Michael Lackey had written a book on African-American atheists during the 1920s and 1930s. So their works then provided sort of a foundation for continued research on the importance of these developments in the 20th century, right? So Black Freethinkers really spans the years from the early 19th century up through the civil rights era of the 1960s and early 1970s. And the book starts out by arguing that the conditions of slavery helped to foster the rise of African-American secularism during the early 19th century. And this is very different from the origins of the Freethought movement among white intellectuals and political activists, right? So for many of them, you know, folks like Paine and others, they often came to their position through an engagement with Enlightenment philosophy, right? Or some took sort of a way station through Unitarianism and liberal religion, which is the topic of the book that I'm writing now. But for African Americans, it was very different, right? So it's not that they didn't have the intellectual capacity to engage with Enlightenment thought, but for many enslaved people, if not most enslaved people, especially in the South, it was actually illegal for them to read, right? And they could be dismembered, or, you know, brutally whipped and punished, or even lose their lives if they repeatedly persisted in reading, right? So for them, their secular positions that they came to were largely a result of observing the sort of hypocritical Christian professions of their masters, right? So Frederick Douglass talks about this in his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845. He has a couple great paragraphs where he's talking about how his master in Maryland, in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, how his master went to a Methodist revival meeting for a couple of days, came back, and Douglass felt that having converted to Methodism and become a professing Christian, now his master would hopefully treat them better, right? Maybe feed them more, beat them a little less, maybe separate less families. And he says that wasn't the case. That when his master came back, having converted to Christianity, he actually became worse, because now he had religious justification for his cruelty, right? He could quote to his slaves Bible lines like, "Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters on earth," right? And that would then become a justification for anything that those masters wanted their enslaved people to do. And this shows up in other narratives of enslaved people as well, right? Harriet Jacobs writes about the exact same development. Master went to a Methodist camp meeting, came back, and was seemingly worse than they had been before. So observing the hypocritical sort of Christian professions of their masters was one of the key reasons that slaves said, well, I don't want anything to do with Christianity. I don't believe in your Christian God. Now, some took that and turned to African traditions, but in the early 19th century, there were many enslaved people who weren't recent arrivals, and neither were their parents or even their grandparents, right? Maybe, they were descended from people who had been brought to the South, to the Southern colonies in the 1670s, 1680s. So by the early 19th century, you have a lot of enslaved people who are very far removed from African tradition. So when they make that decision that they don't believe in the Christian God, there isn't an alternative, right? So that for many leads to an acceptance of atheism. Another key development that really fostered the rise of Black secularism in the early to mid 19th century was the rise of pro-slavery religion, right? And this is basically what it sounds like, using religious precepts, using theology, using the Bible to justify and strengthen the institution of slavery, right? And pro-slavery thinkers did this in a number of ways. They could go back to Genesis and say that the mark that was placed upon Cain after he murdered Abel, that mark turned Cain black, right? So that was one. Another was the curse of Ham, which is actually the curse of Canaan, but basically after Canaan saw his father Ham naked, right? Saw Noah, naked, after the flood, that he was sort of marked forever, right? And his descendants would become sub-Saharan Africans, or even just using things like, Jesus never specifically outlawed the institution of slavery, right? So basically through sort of a literal reading of the Bible, a strict construction, if you will, of the Bible that sort of went along with the political conservatism of the time period. Through that type of reading of the Bible, you actually get more support for the institution of slavery than you do if you were to look at sort of its broader spirit, right? As abolitionists tried to do. So pro-slavery religion and pro-slavery theology really started to take off after the 1830s in the United States. And this was in large part because that was the same time period that saw a drastic ramping up of abolitionist activity, right? So William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, began publication in January of 1831. 2 years later, Garrison and other activists would form the American Anti-Slavery Society, which became the leading abolitionist organization in the country. You'd see widespread petition drives to Congress until the gag rule banning such petitions from being acted on was enacted in 1835. So it's a drastic ramping up of anti-slavery activity in the early 1830s, which then causes the sort of opposite kind of pushback from the defenders of slavery, right? Prior to the really strengthening and growth of the abolitionist movement, they didn't necessarily feel the need to defend slavery as vigorously and on as many fronts as they would begin to do after the 1830s. So pro-slavery religion becomes much more prominent after the 1830s, and witnessing this development is something that would likewise push many enslaved and as well as some free Black people towards atheism and secularism from the 1830s up until the Civil War. Now, the sort of type of free thought we have during the era of slavery is largely atheism and agnosticism, didn't quite move towards secular humanism for most. And that's largely because of the conditions that enslaved people were in, right? They didn't have the opportunity to take their sort of religious or irreligious beliefs, as it were, and then translate that into some type of action, right? So during the era of slavery, it often kind of stayed as a lack of belief in God. Some exceptions, of course, were people like Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown, who were able to gain their freedom and sort of develop that kind of humanistic attitude that would be characteristic of later freethinkers. So we start to see a shift after the Civil War and moving into the early 1900s, right? And one of the key shifts that we see is that African-American freethinkers become more willing to identify themselves as freethinkers, right? So during the era of slavery, what we often have is a number of slave narrators and authors of autobiographies pointing out how the conditions of slavery have caused other slaves to embrace atheism, right? Circumstantial evidence, but I found enough of it across many different narratives and across travel accounts where I definitely think there's something there. But few authors of these autobiographies came out themselves and said that slavery caused me to be an atheist. And that's in large part because given the context of the time, it really would have undermined their credibility. Even if it had been true, it would have it would have undermined their credibility because they were largely speaking to either an evangelical Christian audience or a highly religious audience, maybe, religious folks who were disenchanted with churches, but they still believed in God and were religious nonetheless, right? So that type of identification would have undermined the sort of authority of people writing these autobiographies and narratives. That changes in the early 20th century, right, with a shift in context. So you start to get Black freethinkers who become much more willing to explore secular themes across various genres of writings. And this was especially true with the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and the 1930s. And the Harlem Renaissance would really become a key moment in the history of African-American secularism. In fact, in Black freethinkers, I refer to it as the golden age of Black free thought, something kind of similar to what Susan Jacoby refers to as the golden age of American free thought, namely the time period from, I think she says 1876 to about World War I, right, 1914. Well, right after World War I, that's when we see the sort of golden age of Black free thought, namely a drastic flowering of Black literature, Black writings that explore secular themes in poetry, in novels, in newspaper essays, in books, right? And one of the reasons that the Harlem Renaissance was so important is in part because it was also based off of another broader development, namely the Great Migration, right? The Great Migration witnessed the migration of approximately 1.5 million Black Southerners to different areas of the urban North, right? Moving from the rural South to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, right? In search of opportunity, taking the place of white workers who were often in Europe, right? Fighting for the American army, but also trying to escape economic deprivation and racism in the South, right? It's the same period that the Ku Klux Klan begins its revival, right around 1915. So from 1915 to 1930, we have 1.5 million Black Southerners migrating to the urban North. And for individuals like Langston Hughes, right, author of Goodbye Christ, Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, Claude McKay, W.E.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke, right? Some of the key writers and authors and thinkers of this Harlem Renaissance era. This migration and the sort of intellectual and literary movement that would come to be known as the Harlem Renaissance provided an opportunity for kind of secular community, right? That simply wasn't possible in many cases where they had grown up, right? Du Bois grew up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where there was like the one congregational church in town, right? As was the case with a lot of New England towns. So he grew up very religious and didn't start to express his secularism until college to a certain extent, but much more fully in graduate school when he was in Harvard, right? In urban area. Langston Hughes grew up in Joplin, Missouri, and he writes in his autobiography, The Big C, that he started to doubt the existence of God after a revival service in his church when he was about 13 or 14 years old. But even having these doubts, there wouldn't have been a lot of people in Joplin, Missouri that he really could have shared those ideas with, right? Zora Neale Hurston, growing up in Eatonville, Florida, an all-Black town where she was the daughter of the local preacher. There weren't a lot of people who she could sort of share her religious skepticism with. And she writes about this as well in her 1942 autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. And she even says, like, you know, at the age of 10 and 11 years old, I was seeking and I was questioning, and I didn't believe all of these notions about God that people had been telling me, right? Like, why are babies so small and sickly when they're born, right? Why wouldn't God give them teeth? He knows they need teeth, right? You know, little things like that. She probably doesn't know it yet, but she's questioning God's omnipotence, right? And God's power. But she also says, you know, I couldn't share these questions with other people. Everybody I knew was religious. My father was the preacher. But when she moves to DC first to attend Howard University, where she befriended Alain Locke, another free thinker, and then later on goes to Columbia University to study with the famous free thinker and anthropologist Franz Boas, and then starts to meet folks like Langston Hughes and Du Bois and others. Now they have opportunities to engage in conversation with people about their religious skepticism, right? When most Black people in Harlem are going to church on Sunday afternoon, her and Hughes and Du Bois and others are meeting in A. Philip Randolph's parlor at the same time to discuss religion and politics and economics, right? To have sort of, discussions and services that maybe aren't too different from what you all are trying to do in the Sunday assembly, right? So this is a really key moment in that it provides a community for Black freethinkers at a time when they might not have had that before. And we see questions of religious doubt and skepticism and articulations of atheism and agnosticism across multiple genres, whether it was poems of Langston Hughes like Song for a Dark Girl or Goodbye Christ, whether it's novels written by Nella Larson, such as Quicksand, published in 1928, or anthropological works like Of Mules and Men, and autobiographies like Dust Tracks on a Road, published by Zora Neale Hurston. The leading writers, thinkers, and artists of the Harlem Renaissance used their works to explore questions of secularism, to articulate their dissatisfaction with the orthodox religious ideas of the Black community and of American culture more broadly. Now, one of the sort of impetuses behind the Harlem Renaissance was that, coming off of the end of World War I, there were race riots throughout the country, right? Sometimes Black soldiers who had fought to sort of preserve and uphold democracy in Europe came back to the United States and were attacked at train stations and depots and other places because they were wearing the military uniforms that had been issued by the American government. And you see race riots all throughout the nation. So some Black intellectuals, I say some, not all, but some intellectuals and political activists believe that overt political organizing was a bit dangerous at the time because of this broader context, and that literature, poetry, theater, all of these could be used to make a more subtle case for racial equality, right? That was one of the sort of justifications and reasons for this flowering of African American literature, right? But at the same time, there were a number of Black political activists and leaders who really rejected that position and said, in fact, not only are we going to be very overt with our politics, but we're going to embrace even more radical forms of politics than the two major political parties currently offer. So this is when you start to see a period when you start to see greater engagement with socialism and communism by African Americans. This is for a few different reasons. One, both socialists and communists, at least theoretically, and many times in practice, advocated for a class-based rather than race-based approach to politics, right? And tried to really de-emphasize racial differences in favor of a sort of class politics that could unite people across races and ethnicities, right? So it's the working class against the bourgeoisie. And that working class included whites of all different stripes and from different national backgrounds, as well as Latinos, Blacks from the Caribbean, African Americans, Asians, and others, right? So on a theoretical level, both socialists and communists were for the interests of a very broad working class. And that message seemed to speak to some of the key concerns of Black intellectuals and political activists. But also what I argue in Black freethinkers is that these two parties' approach to religion was likewise attractive to Black freethinkers, right? So the Comintern, for example, the Communist International in 1926 put out a directive stating very explicitly that they expect communists around the world to be atheists, right? And this was really put into practice. I've read sort of the minutes and descriptions of individual communist meetings. And if you were religious, if it was known that you went to church and you were at a communist meeting, you would definitely be ostracized, right? So you were sort of expected to toe the Communist Party line when it came to religion. That was even the case for those Black people, for example, who are atheists, but still went to Egbert Ethelred Brown's Harlem Unitarian Church during the 1920s, right? The communists in New York City were like, I don't know, why are you going to church? Like, you say you're an atheist, but somebody saw you at this church. So both socialists and communists have this identity as non-religious or even anti-religious, and that identity is sort of attractive to African-American freethinkers. So individuals like Hubert Harrison, Harry Haywood, Louise Thompson Patterson, Langston Hughes kind of straddled both lines there, right, with the Harlem Renaissance and socialism. A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, publishers of the Messenger magazine, many of the leading Black intellectuals and political activists of the 19-teens through the 1930s, likewise embraced socialism and communism. In their minds, capitalism and Christianity worked hand in hand to promote and support racism at home and imperialism of African nations abroad, right? So communism sort of helped to foster a non-religious identity, or those who weren't religious were attracted to communism because of that identity. So they really sort of worked hand in hand. And you see that kind of sort of intersection of religion and class in the positions of Black freethinkers during this time period. Black freethinkers ends with sort of a reinterpretation of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s. Not a complete rejection of how this has been interpreted, but I really try to add something new to how we understand this time period, right? During Black History Month, especially, we're getting these reflections on the civil rights movement, and many argue for the centrality of the Black church and Black ministers, and portray the civil rights movement as a religious movement. I don't necessarily refute that portrayal, but I argue in Black freethinkers that we need to have a more sort of nuanced and complex understanding of the civil rights era, because Black secular thinkers and political activists were really at the forefront of civil rights organizing and activity during this time period, right? So we can see this if we look at organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So this was one of sort of the big four civil rights organizations, was more in the kind of traditional wing of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. It was led by Christian activists such as John Lewis, the late John Lewis, and the theologian James Lawson. And it adhered to, Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, right? That was their sort of main tactic and political strategy. This began to change after 1963, when James Forman became the executive secretary of SNCC. Now, Forman had grown up in rural Mississippi, and kind of along the same lines as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. Forman actually kind of converted to atheism, if you will, or began a gradual conversion at the moment where he was supposed to convert to Christianity, right? And it was so interesting to me doing this research that this one story came up multiple times, right? Of somebody, 14, 15 years old, who is at a revival service. They're on the mourner's bench, right? So they're up front, next to the preacher, and the preacher and the whole congregation is praying over them, imploring them to come to Jesus, to accept Christ as their Lord and Savior. And Forman says, in a Baptist tradition and setting, I didn't have the courage to tell my grandmother, who was raising him, that I thought this was all nonsense. He says, so I simply went along, I covered my face with a handkerchief and cried, Lord, have mercy. And he says the people talked of how many got saved that day by the grace of the Lord. But in fact, that was the very moment where he began to doubt Um, he began to doubt Christianity and everything that he'd been told about religion. And later on, a few years later, while he's attending Wilson Junior College in Chicago, taking a philosophy course, he had to write sort of a general paper on the concepts that he'd learned in the class. And what he decided to write was that the class had given him a number of philosophical arguments and tools that disproved the existence of God, right? And Foreman would sort of take those arguments and then develop a kind of secular humanist philosophy, right? If God doesn't exist, what does that mean for me and for my life? Foreman felt that it meant that he was called to do everything he could to improve the conditions of African Americans in this country, because God wasn't going to do it for us, right? And this shows that, for many, if not most, Black atheists after the Civil War, their atheism also led to a secular humanism, right? It didn't just stop at this notion that I don't believe in God, right? It led to further questioning and reflection that if there isn't a God, then here's the type of life that I need to live, and here's the type of person that I need to be, right? So Foreman would take over as executive director of SNCC in 1963 and lead the organization away from its initial Christian identity towards a secular perspective that would embrace the emerging political philosophy of Black power, right? There were many elements of Black power, but some of the key ones were a promotion of Black economic autonomy, right? So a promotion of, purchase things from Black businesses, support Black-owned businesses, a pride in Black culture. So this is where you see a lot of younger activists wearing afros, right? Rejecting Western standards of beauty and wearing their hair naturally as it grows out of their head, wearing African clothing and African garb as opposed to the respectable suits that Christian activists and SCLC wore, things like that, right? Listening to Black music. And independent Black political action. So moving towards mobilizing Black communities to support Black political candidates. So this is where in the late 1960s and early 1970s, you start to get the first Black mayors of major cities, right? Like Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, and so on. Another key element was a rejection of the philosophy of nonviolence, right? This sort of Christian and Indian philosophy that really animated the Christian wing of the civil rights movement. Advocates of Black power said, no, we have a right to defend ourselves. They didn't advocate that in rejecting violence, they didn't advocate violence, but they stated their willingness to use violence if they were attacked by racists, right? And these political ideals were really encapsulated in the political organization named the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, right? Black power was an ideology, but the Black Panther Party would be sort of the institutional expression of that ideology. And if we look at some of the major leaders of the Black Panther Party, they too embraced atheism and agnosticism, right? Huey Newton grew up kind of like Zora Neale Hurston, the son of a preacher. He actually had planned on becoming a preacher himself until he started attending Merritt College in Oakland, California, taking philosophy courses and reading Albert Camus and Sartre and other existentialist philosophers, and slowly but surely moving towards atheism and a secular humanist perspective. Eldridge Cleaver was a minister of information of the Black Panther Party, who did some time in jail during the 1950s for selling marijuana, and would encounter the works of Thomas Paine and other early American freethinkers while incarcerated, and would become an atheist, right? David Hilliard was another key leader of the Black Panther Party who would embrace atheism. And reading works like Huey Newton's autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, you can see that some of the major goals of the Black Panther Party were framed as kind of humanist in nature, right? That they saw things like the free breakfast program for children that was incredibly widespread and their most popular program throughout the nation. Things like running ambulance services and free health clinics and doing job training and providing legal defense to those who were wrongly accused of crimes. Newton stated very explicitly that he saw these as his responsibility as somebody who was not a believer and who felt that human beings needed to take action to improve their worlds, right? Additionally, the organ of the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther newspaper, likewise contained essays, poems, and letters that articulated the humanist perspective of both its rank and file membership and its leaders. So when we look at some of the leaders of the more traditional, right, big four civil rights organizations like SNCC, when we look at the leaders of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, as well as some of the main authors and artists in the Black arts movement of the mid-1960s, folks like James Baldwin in his work, The Fire Next Time, and Lorraine Hansberry in some of her work, we can see that secularism was a key part of Black intellectual and political life during the civil rights movement. So this was not solely a religious movement, even though religious organizations and leaders were prominent in it. It was also a movement that was really in large part run by secular thinkers and secular activists. And it really highlights, I think, the key role and significance that secularism has played in African-American culture and in African-American politics from the 19th century up through the civil rights era. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us this morning and presenting this. Just seemed like the right thing for right now, for what we need. But I'm going to just go ahead and jump straight into the Q&A, and I'll start with the first question from myself. And I know this is kind of a softball, but free thought among African Americans has been largely downplayed or flat out ignored throughout our collective study of history. So why do you think that is?
Yeah, couple of reasons. Among whites, I believe there's this long-standing idea of a kind of innate and sort of uber religiosity of African Americans. So I talk about this in the introduction to the book. This is something that really goes back at least to the 1830s, when the Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing wrote in his book Slavery that Africans and African Americans are naturally affectionate and overly emotional, and it's in large part because of what he refers to as their sort of natural religion or natural propensities towards religion. These ideas weren't just expressed by ministers, right? They were also expressed by white freethinkers. I found like the editor of The Truth Seeker and other writers, other sort of authors of articles in The Truth Seeker in the late 19th century articulated the very same ideas, right? This belief in the sort of innate religiosity of Black people, I think has led a lot of people in that population to really not even conceive of free thought being important among African Americans. Now, within, among Blacks themselves, especially like Black historians, I've argued that the sort of function of Black history as a political project aimed at securing citizenship and equality in the United States has meant that highlighting stories of Black atheists and agnostics and those who sort of fell outside of the bounds of religious propriety would not aid in that sort of project of showing that Blacks were moral and patriotic citizens who deserved to either be freed from slavery, if we're talking about prior to 1865, or who deserved full equality as citizens, if we're talking about the period after.
So it kind of ties into reluctance to tell those stories in light of Christian nationalism as a overall.
Exactly, right. And many Black people have bought sort of lockstep into that notion that this is a Christian nation, right? And so one of the things I'm not doing is trying to sort of undermine or show that Black freethinkers were somehow a majority of the population or anything like that, right? Black people, like American people more broadly, are largely religious, right? So have bought into notions of Christian nationalism.
Right. Our next question is, can you talk a little about how the general conservatism of religion might affect the voting tendencies of those believers who also have civil justice as a part of the church's messaging?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for many African Americans, I mean, probably most African Americans, there's a kind of interesting combination of social conservatism with political liberalism, right? So for those Blacks who identify as Christian, the overwhelming majority are evangelical Christians, right? And when we talk about evangelicals in America, we don't generally think of Black Christians, but it is the case that most are evangelical. So many are socially conservative. They, oppose abortion and gay marriage, although that's changing slowly but surely. But even with that social conservatism, there is a kind of political liberalism, right? And that's something that really stretches back to the early 19th century, and the the sort of use of churches and the sort of leadership of religious figures in things like the anti-slavery movement of the early 19th century, even into the mid to late 20th century. You had a number of communities where the minister or the pastor is sort of the leader of that community, right? Maybe one of the only people with a higher education and those types of credentials. So religion has been really central in African American culture and in African American communities. In many cases, has led to a certain type of conservatism, just not in as many cases that also is combined with political conservatism.
Next question. So why do you think that Christianity still has such a strong hold on the Black community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's partially historical, right? So the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we write about the importance of the Black church kind of reinforce that sense of religiosity and that kind of religious identity, right? So it might be your someone's grandmother or something saying, well, without the church, this civil rights movement wouldn't have even happened, as a way of kind of reinforcing that this is a key part of our identity, right? Another main reason is the failings of white secular organizations to effectively appeal to these populations, right? So it isn't just, like I said, that Black people are naturally religious, and that's why Christianity has such a hold. It's one, in part cultural, but two, in part that white Freethought organizations have often not tried to reach out to expand their membership among African Americans, right? And they haven't developed as effective tools as they could, right? They've sometimes overly emphasized things like the separation of church and state or the teaching of evolution in schools, and not necessarily spoken to things that are much more kind of relevant to African Americans, right? So for a Black population that, in many cities in this country are suffering from healthcare disparities or lack of adequate housing, economic deprivation, talking about evolution in schools isn't really going to cut it, right? But showing up to some protest or some type of political action, or showing up to a community meeting and supporting them and advocating for more effective systemic change that will help those communities, those are the types of things that are going to be more appealing. So one, it's something within African American sort of culture and history. But also, I think in part, it's a failing on the part of secular organizations to effectively appeal to that group of people.
I think I'm going to close the Q&A with this next question. I know our discussion now has your presentation this morning basically led up to the civil rights movement, but could you maybe drop some names of Black free thinkers that are active now that we can kind of follow and be?
Absolutely. Number one is to support the work of Black Non-Believers Incorporated, founded by Mandisa Thomas in 2011. Any way that you can support them, whether it's helping to donate and support the Women of Color Beyond Belief conference, or signing up for some of their events, right? They have a great cruise that they go on every late fall, right? But just supporting that organization in any way possible. Two would be Black Skeptics of Los Angeles, a more local organization, but led by and founded by Sakivu Hutchinson. So definitely, buy some of her books on Amazon, right? Godless Americana and Moral Combat, but also help to support the First in the Family Humanist Scholarship that Black Skeptics of LA started, I think maybe close to a decade ago now, that helps to send young people of color, LGBTQ identified individuals, and young humanists to college, right? And finally, I mentioned him earlier, but the work of Professor Anthony Pinn has really been foundational in helping us to come to a broader understanding of African-American humanism. So he has a great sort of collection of primary sources on the topic called By These Hands. I forget the subtitle. It's like a documentary record of African-American humanism or something, but just look up Anthony Pinn By These Hands and read some of his other works. He also has an autobiography talking about his evolution from being a Methodist minister to one of the leading Black freethinkers in the country today. So yeah, those three.
And I know that we here at Sunday Assembly Nashville are also familiar with Mandisa Thomas and her work with Black non-believers. So thank you very much for that.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. So let's move on to our second poll for the morning. Once again, menti.com and the code 4329086. So our question for this poll is, by percentage, African-American men are more religious than African-American women. True or false? So we'll let that poll hang there for a bit. And in the meantime, right now, we'll be moving to our minute of mindfulness, the kind of a part of the morning where we can kind of sit with everything that we've heard so far this morning, ponder things, kind of kind of create our little sense of calm, kind of a break in the program. And we'll go ahead and start that.
And 3, 2, 1, thank you.
I was born by the river in a little town. Oh, just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming. I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die. 'Cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. Oh, but then I go to my sister, and I say, sister, help me, please. But she winds up knocking me back down on my knees. Back down on my knees. Oh, there are times when I thought I couldn't last for long. But now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming. I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's been a long time coming. I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
Gosh, we are so fortunate to have such outstanding singers and musicians as part of Sunday Assembly Nashville. I just love it so much. But let's switch back to that poll number 2, we're looking at that. But by percentage, African American men are more religious than African American women. Is that true or false? And most everybody said false. So, yay, good to go. That is pretty much how things skew. So, it's good to know, to be able to check our knowledge every so often. So now that our second poll, we kind of went through that. Let's go ahead and switch to poll number 3. So just as again, kind of a little knowledge check. Which of these are famous Black atheists / non-believers? And you'll see your choices there at the bottom. And while you are going with your voting there, I'll go ahead and go into our announcements. So our announcement number 1 is, as I mentioned earlier, we are 100% volunteer led. None of us in Sunday Assembly Nashville receive any kind of payment for any of this, but we do still have operational costs as our own Lori Butler would say, where 2 or more are gathered, there are expenses. So you're seeing on your screen here, you can become a sustaining member through PayPal, set that and forget it, or you can make a one-time donation through SundayAssemblyNashville.com. You can scan that little QR code there, and that will get you to the right place. And going back to how we are completely run by volunteers, so we're always looking for people to help out, and especially right now as we're starting to get that build up back to our live in-person meetings. So we're definitely going to need more volunteers there. So you can see on your screen basically our different committees. If you're wanting to get involved in the production side of Sunday Assembly, you can reach out to Jason Panks. If you're wanting to get involved in the music side, you can get in touch with Stephen Phelps. Brenda Quinn runs our Live Better committee. This is kind of the Sunday Assembly events that are outside the main program. Things like our spring picnic and other events of that sort. Our Help Often committee is currently being headed up by Kate Turner. This is our committee where we find ways to help and assist in our community. Examples of that would be pre-pandemic. We would volunteer to sort food at the Second Harvest Food Bank, or pack diapers for those mothers in need, things of that sort. Wonder More, headed by me. As I mentioned earlier, this is the running and basically designing our monthly programs. And then our promo team, which is, our social media, our graphic design, all of things of that sort, is being run by Tom Kunish. And to answer a question in the chat, we do not currently have a listing of the committees and all of that up yet, but it is my understanding that we are working on that, because that's good information to have, especially if someone is wanting to have that contact. So kind of a push for volunteers for the graphic design, social media side. I know their March kind of says to be determined, but I will be announcing that here in a bit. But April, all of that is still kind of open right now. So you can contact Tom if you'd like to get involved with that. And if you don't know how to get a hold of him, get a hold of any of us. We can guide you in the right direction. So we're on all the socials. We've got Facebook, we have Twitter, we have Instagram, we have a Discord server. So, like, share, subscribe, all those things, and get connected with us, and then have a way to spread what we do out elsewhere. So as Dr. Cameron mentioned earlier, as an organization that is active in the Black Freethought community, this month's charitable donation will be going to the Black Skeptics of Los Angeles, and more specifically to the aforementioned First in the Family Humanist Scholarship. And that scholarship is available for secular, humanist, and atheist/non-theist students of African descent who demonstrate leadership and activism in their communities. And we have a couple of upcoming events between now and next assembly. Franco is organizing a group to go to a free tour of the National Museum of African American Music here in Nashville on this coming Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. The cap on that is set at 14, and there are already 6 who have RSVP'd and reserved their spot for that. So all those details and RSVP will be on Meetup. But if you're not able to make that, if you're not able to make it Wednesday or not able to make it at that time, the museum is offering free admission every Wednesday this month from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And our second event that's coming up, and one that is near and dear to my heart, if you know me at all, Jeannie has picked up the game night hosting duties. And so that is coming up on Sunday, March 6th from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. She's kind of theming it games with apps. So, you can bring your games and or appetizers that we can nom on while we're there. So those details and RSVP are also on Sunday Assembly Nashville's Meetup page. So next assembly is on March 13th, 2022, second Sunday. We have Dr. Kent Wallace lined up. He'll be speaking on a physics-related topic. So, I'm looking forward to that. Definitely, part of that, wonder more about the world around us. And in addition, in recognition of Women's History Month, we will have 3 of our Sunday Assembly women speak about other women, historical or otherwise, who have influenced them. And fingers crossed, April's assembly, we are planning on going live, of course, following all CDC guidelines about masking, vaccinations, all of that good stuff. So trying to be responsible, but at the same time, opening things up to maybe start these in-person meetings back up that we have been sorely missing since 2 years ago. So with that, I will start out with my closing thoughts for the evening. Wow. Morning. That's Josh for you. Anyway, sometimes one of the most difficult things that we do is self-reflection, especially as an organization with multiple selves and multiple people involved, and being hit with the realization that we may have been doing something harmful and or toxic, even if we've been doing our best not to do so. But sometimes the more difficult thing is figuring out what to do about it and doing that work. We just have to remember that the work is important and necessary to do, no matter how hard that work is. And we also now have more knowledge about the thread of free thought throughout our known history. And we also know how that thread can be easily covered up and buried. But we also know that we stand on the shoulders of giants as we champion reason and free thought as our motivating factors. And that in both of these, our work never ends. And all that we can do is try our best, and all that we do, and we keep pushing for the betterment of our fellow people here on this planet. And no Josh hosted assembly would be complete without a bad pun. So I tried to find one that fit with our theme. But I couldn't find one that didn't prove that we still have a lot of work to do. So with that said, Stephen, please take us away.
Happy to. Thank you so much. This is a great presentation today. I learned a lot, and I enjoyed every moment of it. We're going to go out with our traditional closer, I Believe in Good. Sing along at home if you want to do that.
2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
I believe in good. Oh, I believe in good. I believe in being good and doing good just for goodness sake. Good makes the whole world better. Good is great, and I believe in harmony. Respect for all humanity. I believe that we will find the only truth we need, living this one life by this one creed. I believe in good. I believe in good. I believe in good. Oh, I believe in good. I believe in being good and doing good just for goodness sake. Good makes the whole world better. Good is great, and I believe in harmony. Respect for all humanity. I believe that we will find the only truth we need, living this one life by this one creed. I believe in good.